Shalom. Today's parsha that we're going to be discussing is Parshas Bamidbar, the parsha that discusses the Jewish people, and the Sefer, the book that discusses the Jewish people in the wilderness, and also it's relevant for the holiday of Shavuot. It says in the pasuk that the Jewish people lived in the desert, and it says about that, Esfali Shivim Ish Miziknei Yisrael, gather for me 70 elders from the Bnei Yisrael. Gemara in Yuma, Daf Chav Chasam Abayz, says that this gathering was a yeshiva. That's how they gathered. It said when there were Jewish people were in the desert, there was a yeshiva with them. So let's analyze that phrase. So our parsha begins with this idea of Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe b'Midbar Sinai. And God spoke to Moshe in the Sinai wilderness. And the Midrash Rabbah states that the Torah was nitna, the Torah was given in three places. The Torah was given with Eish, with Mayim, and in the Midbar. The Torah was given in fire, in water, and in the wilderness. So why was the Torah specifically given to Bnei Israel in the wilderness? So about that, there's a parable. There's a lot of different explanations of this. One parable that I saw was from the Ben Ish Chai. The holy Ben Ish Chai gives the following parable, that there was once a very wealthy and wise, eligible bachelor, and he came from a very wealthy family. He's very wise, very kind, and he was looking for a shidduch. He was looking for a match. So all the matchmakers lined up to find him a match, and nothing was working for him. So finally, there was one matchmaker that came forward, and this matchmaker said to him, I have a perfect bride for you. The only thing is, she lives in a very faraway village, and her parents are very, very poor. But if you're interested, she's got amazing qualities associated with her. She's wise, she's modest, she's kind, she's got a good sense of humor, she's got everything that, very, very person who could be really appropriate for you. So the man who was trying to become a groom said, I'll go travel. And indeed, he traveled to meet her, and he was in love. He said, this is the perfect person for me to spend the rest of my life with. And he said to the girl's father, I'd like to marry your daughter. I'd like her to be my bride. And they were very, very, very poor people. And the girl's father said, yes, you can marry her on one condition. She's my only daughter. I'd like the wedding to be in our village. And the village was, the groom was coming from a very fancy city, a very fancy house in a fancy city. And the village was in the middle of nowhere. And he said, not only that, I'd like you to live in this village for the first few years of the marriage. She's my only daughter. I'd like you to live here. And the groom said, yeah, well, you know what? It's not ideal to live in this village. I'm used to a big city, but nevertheless, this is what's necessary for love. I'm going to do that. So at that point, they agreed to get married, and the night before the wedding, the father of the bride asked to speak to the groom, and he showed him a box, and it was filled with the most precious jewels in the world. It turns out that the bride's family was actually much wealthier than the groom's family. And the father of the bride said, listen, I have all my money, and we have only one daughter. I want to give it to her as an inheritance. And I want to make sure that the person who was marrying her really was marrying her because he loved her and not because of the money that we're going to give to her. And so, says the Ben Ish Chai, the parable is for the Jewish people. Hashem took us into the wilderness. Hashem wanted to see whether or not we would accept the Torah on the basis of the Torah, and not do it for any external matters related to it, like whether it's in a fancy metropolis. Hashem took us out of the central city, the capital of the world, Egypt, and brought us into a place of wilderness. There was nothing there, barrenness, to see if we would still accept the Torah. And when we did accept the Torah, when our ancestors accepted the Torah, then Hashem showed us all the jewels that are associated with the Torah. So that's the story, that's the parable that the Ben Ish Chai gives to explain why the Torah was given in the wilderness. The second explanation that I was thinking of, why was the Torah given in the wilderness? Why was it specifically given Bamidbar Sinai? Is because life is a wilderness. Life is a wilderness. And what is our path out of the wilderness of life, the path out of the wilderness of life is Torah. Torah is our guide. Torah is our path out of the wilderness of life. And this can be seen from the quotation that we started off our discussion today with. It can be seen from a passage that we studied in Daf Yomi this week on Yoma, Daf Chasam Beis. The Talmud discusses in the Daf Yomi that Avram Avinu, he knew the exact moment where it became midday. He knew the exact moment where the sun was directly over the wall to demonstrate that that was the exact moment where it was midday. And Avram Avinu knew this. He was the only one in the world. So therefore, Avram could pray mincha at exactly midday. The rest of us, we have to wait a half hour after midday in order to pray. And the Gemara asks, how did Avram Avinu know when exactly it was midday? How did Avram Avinu know this? So the Gemara explains, Avram sat in the yeshiva and learned. And because he sat in the yeshiva and studied, he had the clarity of mind to understand the ways of the world. He sat and he studied Torah. This gave him perspective and showed him the secrets of the world. And that's why he was able to know exactly when it was midday. And so this is what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Avram was different because he was a zaken v'yoshev b'yeshiva. He was a zaken, he was an elder, and he sat in yeshiva. And that's where the Shekhinah rests. And so there, in the yeshiva, says the Gemara, he developed the expertise to determine the precise hour. And so says Rav Chama, the son of Rav Chanina, from the days of our ancestors, there was always a yeshiva. There was always a yeshiva amongst the Jewish people. Now, obviously, the term yeshiva is anachronistic, but the Talmud is telling us there was always, from the days of our ancestors, there's always a group, a community dedicated deeply to Torah studies. Our ancestors, says the Gemara, were leaders of their generations who taught Torah to students who came to them. When they were in Egypt, there was a yeshiva with them. That's what it says. And we know that Yosef must have studied, but Rashi tells us that Yaakov sent Yehuda down Lahoros. He set up a yeshiva. As it says, Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem said to Moshe, go and gather the elders of Israel. That means that there were sages amongst them who studied the Torah. And when they were in the wilderness, Esfali Shiva Mishmi Ziknei Yisrael. And when they were in the wilderness, there was a yeshiva. Avram himself sat in yeshiva, because it says that Avram was old, and the word zaken is associated with the yeshiva. So also Yitzchak sat in yeshiva, says the Gemara. It says, when Yitzchak was old and his eyes were dim, he was old, he was sitting in yeshiva. And Yaakov was an elder, zaken v'yoshev b'yeshiva, as it states that Israel's eyes were heavy with age. Also Eliezer, servant of Avraham, he sat in yeshiva. It says, as Avram said to his servant, Zakan Beito Moshel B'Kol Asher Lo. So when Avram was sitting in yeshiva, Rabbeinu Yaakov explains that he was able to determine the nature of the world with greater clarity. Yeshiva is a space to sit and ponder the ways of our Creator, to gain insight into the ways of the world. And through Torah study, the true yeshiva is able not only to influence its own students, but also to influence all the people in the world who are affected by the rays of light emanating from the yeshiva. According to Rambam, the foundation of our faith was a yeshiva begun by Abraham and passed down from generation to generation all the way to the current period. Says the Rambam that Avraham Avinu, how did he know? He said, Rambam says this in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, chapter 1, law, halacha gimel, chapter 1, law 3. He says that Avraham Avinu, at his young age, he began to look at the world and he realized that there has to be a God in the world. Not many gods, but one God. So Avram understood this, and he gathered people around him, and he established a yeshiva, a place for thousands of people to come and study Torah, and from their knowledge of the Torah, they would be able to influence the entire world. And so that's what Avram Avinu did. He started a yeshiva to influence the world. So that's, and from Avram, the Rambam lists, it passed down from generation to generation. So the Midrash states about the words, Bamidbar Sinai, that Hashem did not wish to rest the Shekhinah on the sea or on the mountains, but rather specifically in the wilderness. The intent of this is that Hashem only wanted to place the Shekhinah on someone who imagines oneself to be a wilderness. That is to say that somebody knows that no matter how much Torah one has studied, there's a need for more, and that the surface has barely been scratched. One must be aware that if one does not commit to Torah study with great effort, it will not be able to be attained, and no one else will be able to do the task for us. Just like in a wilderness, where we are all alone without anyone to help, so too, we're in the wilderness, and we need the Torah to be our guide. Only such a person who recognizes this is worthy to receive the Torah and the Shekhinah. And so this is the essence of a yeshiva. It's a place where one realizes how little one knows about life and how much more somebody has to learn. It's a place where a person commits with all one's strength and energy to gain insight into our Creator. Like we cited above the Midrash Rabbah that says the Torah was given with fire, water, and the wilderness. So the Midrash answers, why was the Torah given in these ways, in these three ways? So the Midrash explains, just as these things are free to everybody in the world, so too the words of Torah are free to everyone in the world. As it states in Isaiah chapter 55, let all who are thirsty go and drink the water. What is the water of our life? The water is Torah. I tell the story about Rabbi Yaakov Galinsky, that when he was a student in a small yeshiva in Krainik, he felt like he was slipping with his Torah study. He wasn't studying enough Torah. He needed chizuk. He needed to be strengthened. So he decided he would go to the Rosh Yeshiva, and he said to the Rosh Yeshiva, give me strength, strengthen me. How am I going to grow in my Torah study? So the Rosh Yeshiva said, go to Navardik. Navardik was a yeshiva famous for giving people strength and musar to be able to help people grow with their Torah study. He said, go to Navardik, and I'm going to write you a letter as an introduction to a special student there who's known for being able to strengthen people in Torah study. So Rabbi Yaakov, he set off for Navardik. He brought a suitcase. He was expecting to stay there a little bit so he could learn how to be strengthened and inspired so that he could study Torah with greater devotion. He got to Navardik. He brought the letter to the student, and he said to the student, help me, inspire me to learn, he said. So the student says, I can't inspire you. You have to inspire yourself. I can't inspire you. So he said, well, how do I inspire myself? What do I do? So the student said to him, okay, there's a synagogue nearby. It's called the synagogue Liber Rachel. This synagogue, it's the Baal they daven there early in the morning, then it's empty the whole day. So go there, go there, sit in the corner, and when you're sitting there, you're going to, be able to study a book of Musar for an hour straight, and then come back and see what it does for you. So he said, okay, I'll do that. He goes to the synagogue. He goes in. It's dark. He comes in, and he hears from the women's section that there's people who are talking in the women's section, and he hears one boy, a voice coming, a boy sitting up there, and he was quoting the Gemara in Eruvin, and the Gemara in Eruvin says that a person should grab and eat chatof ve'achol, because the world is like a wedding feast. It's like a hilula, meaning to say grab and eat while you can, because the world is passing by like a wedding feast, and the next thing you know, we're gone from this world. But this boy kept repeating chatof ve'achol, grab and eat, and Rabbi Yaakov understood that what the boy was saying was, I have to maximize my time on this world because I have to grab as much Torah study, and because it's fleeting. Everything else is fleeting. Everything else is passing in this world except for Torah study. Torah is our knowledge, is our source, is our guide through the wilderness. It's all about trying to grab as much as we can so we can guide ourselves and guide others, and teach and transmit and be a source of strength to so many others in the world. And when Rabbi Yaakov saw this boy doing this, he quickly ran back to the yeshiva, to Navardik, grabbed his suitcase, ran right back to the yeshiva, and he sat and he learned in order to be able to teach to others. And years later, he said, you know who that boy was? That boy was the great the Gaon, Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And so he said, this is our world that we have to be. What have we done through our generations? How have we passed the Torah down? Through yeshiva, through people who have understood that the essence of our life, the essence of our world is truth, and to pass down the truth of our Torah from generation to generation so that we can enlighten the world and bring the world the light of the Torah.